My name's Sarah B., and this is Time and Other Thieves, Reflections and Conversations on the Nature of Existence. This episode originally aired in radio format on August 26th, 2021. Today's episode is going to focus on climate change.
One of the things that came out recently is Exxon, I don't know how it was released, but the study that Exxon did back in the 70s, I believe, they had scientists do a study on the effects of burning fossil fuels on the global climate, and they came to the conclusion that if we kept doing what we were doing, we were going to be screwed in a relatively short period of time. Like by now, that things would have kicked into an irreversible pattern. But they kept that study hidden, and it doesn't take a genius to realize why, but now we realize that the corporations knew it 50 years ago. Then of course the governments knew it, so a decision was made to just keep going and make as much money as possible.
Preparing for this episode has been an emotional process, as it has required that I once again take a close look at the facts of our current situation on this planet, and those facts are, quite frankly, terrifying. But in order to respond effectively to the predicament that our species has created for itself, we have to know what's really going on. And it just so happens that my husband, Whitman, has been doing extensive climate change research for at least the past 10 years, just on his own, not as part of any research team. He does not claim to be an expert, but he does read the experts, which I rarely bother to do myself. So I'm going to share some of a recent conversation I had with him about what his studies have taught him. I'm always impressed by Whitman's ability to retain and synthesize and articulate such complex information. And it's especially impressive when considering how very shifty the sands of climate change reporting can be. When the truth is not deliberately hidden from us by corporations and governing bodies, which you just heard Whitman talking about, it's twisted to fit a more convenient, less dread-inducing narrative that serves to keep people in problem-solving mode, which is downright harmful at this point. You'll hear Whitman talk about that shortly in regards to the latest IPCC report, the gist of which is that humans are the cause of climate change and that regardless of what we do now, temperatures are going to keep rising, weather events will continue to get more extreme, Arctic summers could soon be free of ice, sea levels will keep rising, and we have about 20 years to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions if there's any hope for limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. That last part is sketchy, though, given that the baseline from which we're gauging that temperature increase keeps changing. After Whitman lays down the brass tacks of our situation, I'll expand on the dangers of trying to fix the climate crisis in my discussion of Joanna Macy's Work That Reconnects and Jem Bendell's Deep Adaptation work.
These are the main points that people kind of need to know.
You ready? All right, let's do this.
Humans, Homo sapiens, are living on a planet that's warmer than they've ever experienced. And the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere is the highest it's been in something like 70 million years. We've got more people on the planet than there have ever been, which I guess is obvious, but it's the rate of the population growth that's insane. In 1800, there were 1 billion people on the planet, and it had taken 250,000 years to get them. And now there are 7.5 billion, something like that. And they say by 2050, it might be 9 or even 10 billion if we keep going at this rate. That exponential increase is something that doesn't happen in nature. In nature, if there are too many frogs in the pond, any given habitat reaches its carrying capacity, there's a massive die-off. And we think we're an exception to that. But we are mammals on this planet, this large organism, and we're dependent on clean air and clean water and good soil, and all of that is at risk. The ocean has been the main carbon sink all this time, and that's been absorbing all the CO2 and the heat that the greenhouse gases trap in the atmosphere. So the ocean can only absorb so much, but it's been doing a valiant job. But the temperature has heated up significantly, and the CO2 changes the chemistry of the ocean, so it's acidified a lot, which accounts for most of the coral bleaching, and also the deoxygenation of the ocean. So those three things are major, and they're not going to just stop tomorrow if we stop all of our carbon emissions. They take a minimum of thousands of years, probably tens of thousands of years, for some sort of homeostasis to be regained on that front. And that's just one aspect of this. We have the atmosphere, we have the sea ice on the poles. So yeah, I mean, there are various parts of the world that are turning on us, if you will. The Siberian forests, the taiga across the northern hemisphere. The permafrost is melting, and all the stored carbon in the permafrost is being released as methane. Same thing with the seafloor in the Arctic Ocean. The methane clathrates, they call it, that's melting and emitting massive amounts of methane, which is far more dangerous greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. They worry about a methane bomb being released. I forget how many gigatons they postulate could come at once, which would be pretty much game over.
What would trigger that?
It's just the melting of the seafloor. And the reason that's happening is because the Arctic sea ice is melting so quickly. They're calling for a blue ocean event any year now, which is, it doesn't mean that there's no sea ice at the end of the summer, but so little that it's not really going to replenish itself enough to keep the same system going.
When I asked Whitman to speak to the most recent report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, he first harkened back to the Kyoto Protocol
in the early 90s, the first big meeting of all the climate scientists talking about this, when some people were trying to make it known that, hey, everything's changing and we might be in trouble. They agreed on 1750 as the date for the beginning of industrial civilization, basically when we started burning coal. So they agreed that all of the measurements for the Earth's temperature and various things should refer to that as a baseline, the beginning point. But the results from that have been less than encouraging. So most of the studies now use a point in the middle of the 1800s or sometimes even into the 1900s as a baseline. So this most recent report, as far as I've been able to tell, I haven't read the entire report, but I look at these various scientists who try and parse them. This report was using an average global temperature from between the years of 1850 and 1900 as a baseline. And it determined that we have warmed the global environment 1.1 degrees Celsius. Now, also way back when they started this, everyone agreed that 2 degrees Celsius warming above the pre-industrial average would pretty much be the threshold beyond which we're toast. So they say, all right, we're at 1.1 degrees warming. That gives us a window of such and such. What they're trying to do is keep us from getting to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And they say, well, that gives us 20 years or 30 years or whatever. And if we reduce carbon emissions, etc., we can get there. And we won't be even close to 2 degrees Celsius and we'll save the world. Well, if we're using 1750 as a baseline, we're at or very close to 2 degrees Celsius already. And we show no signs of reducing carbon emissions anytime soon. And frankly, I don't know how we could do that without reducing population.
So our methods of gauging temperature increase are dubious. I read Rebecca Solnit's article in The Guardian about the most recent IPCC report and was surprised to see that no baseline was mentioned. 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming comes up a lot, but never in relation to any past date. So 1.5 degrees warmer than when? Another goalpost that apparently keeps moving is related to carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere.
I mean, right now we're at about 420 parts per million carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. I remember, not very long ago, late 90s, early aughts, Bill McKibben and his group, 350.org, they were saying 350 parts per million is the tipping point, the threshold, and we have to keep it below that. Now we're at 420. So, what are you going to do? You're going to say, all right, now the new threshold is 450 or whatever. And then when we get there, we'll say something else. So I just try to keep...
Do you think Bill McKibben do you think he stands by that?
I mean, at the time, it was all based on the best science that we had. And it seemed like we wouldn't get to that point for a long time. But what keeps happening is we get to the point quicker and quicker and quicker.
I wonder what he thought would happen at 350.
Well, they thought it would be runaway greenhouse effect, runaway warming. And some would say that we've indeed started that. But that's a whole debate. I mean, it's kind of like accountants. You can use the numbers to argue pretty much anything. So it's really hard for us as, information consumers to go through and try and discern, well, what is actually happening?
While it might be difficult to decipher some climate change reports and predictions, nature tends to be more straightforward in telling us what's really going on. Messages coming from the Arctic are especially loud and clear.
It's a tipping point. They're talking about, when are we going to reach these tipping points? And one of the ones is the Arctic sea ice. At some point, if there's so little ice up there, it's pretty much going to go rapidly. The analogy that I heard a scientist use is, you have your ice in your drink, your gin and tonic or whatever at the cocktail party, and as long as there's a fair amount of ice in that drink, it stays cool. But once it gets down to a certain amount, there might still be a cube or two, but once it gets down below a certain amount of ice in that amount of liquid, it warms up to room temperature really quickly. So the same thing is happening in the ocean. When we lose the sea ice, we lose the albedo effect, the reflectivity. When the polar cap is all white, it's reflecting all the solar radiation back out into the atmosphere. When it becomes dark blue, as it melts and becomes water, it absorbs all that solar radiation, which causes more sea ice to melt, which causes more solar radiation to be absorbed, which causes more sea ice to melt. So that's like the prime example of the self-reinforcing feedback loop. And some of these scientists have identified dozens of those kinds of self-reinforcing feedback loops, 60 some, in the Earth system. That's one of the biggest and most profound, but they're all over the place, and they've kicked into gear, so we can't stop it. So we lose the albedo effect with the sea ice, but also, in addition to polar bear habitat, which of course is saddening for everyone because we love our charismatic megafauna, we probably more importantly, we lose the algae that grows on the underside of the sea ice, because the algae feeds the krill and the plankton, which feed everything else in the damn ocean. So when we lose that sea ice, we're cutting the base of the marine food chain off at the knees. Same thing with the coral reefs in the more tropical areas. But another thing about the Arctic is that the polar vortex, the jet stream, normally just kind of circles nicely around the Arctic. And then occasionally in the winter, it'll dip down and we'll have storms and, big blasts of cold weather into the continent of, North America. Same thing happens over in Europe and Asia. But for the most part, it keeps all that cold air up at the top of the planet. Same thing's happening on the southern hemisphere, but it's more complicated because it's a continent. So now what's happening, because the Arctic is warming 4 or 5 times faster than everywhere else, what's happening is that the integrity of that polar jet stream is falling apart. So weird things are happening, like extremely high temperatures very far north above the Arctic Circle at odd times of year, close to 100 degrees. And meanwhile, down here, North Carolina, places like this, we have occasionally really cold, they call it the polar vortex or something, insanely cold periods in the winter, which prompts people to say, oh, global warming, what are you talking about? This is the coldest we've had in so many years. But this is one of the paradoxes about climate change, and that's why it's a better phrase than global warming. Even though the whole planet is warming, it doesn't mean that it's necessarily hotter everywhere. So as we have these insane breaks in the polar jet stream, all this cold air streams southward. But meanwhile, as that's happening, all the warm air is going north. So I heard a scientist use the analogy of opening the freezer door. You go to your fridge, you open the freezer door, and you get hit in the face with all this cold air, right? That's us in the south. But meanwhile, the warm air from the kitchen is going into the freezer, and that's what's happening up at the Arctic, which just furthers the melting. So that's one of the things that's sort of counterintuitive that would be helpful for people to understand. Another is that as all of the ice on Greenland melts, what's happening is this massive amount of cold, fresh water is pouring into the North Atlantic. And another study recently came out saying that, lo and behold, the Gulf Stream, it's actually called the AMOC, the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Current, of which the Gulf Stream is a part, that's slowing down, which is a problem. It's worrisome.
Humans have run amok on the AMOC.
Have run amok on the AMOC. Yes.
Oh, we do have fun, don't we? It's important to have a sense of humor about this stuff when you can. And then there's Antarctica.
The South Pole, of course, is all this ice is on a continent, right? The Arctic, the ice is floating on the ocean. So once that ice is gone, it's open ocean, which is going to absorb so much heat. It's going to take longer for the ice on Antarctica and Greenland to melt, but it's happening faster than anyone thought it would be possible. Because I think the ice sheet on Greenland is something like 5 miles thick.
He later confirmed it's actually over 1 mile thick.
It's insane. It's taken a long time for that to accumulate, and it's dense, it's heavy, but it's melting fast. So, yeah, there's a study that came out recently saying that the amount of ice that has melted off of the Greenland ice sheet this year, 2021, just during the months of June and July, produced enough fresh water to cover the state of Florida under 2 inches of water. And that's just 2 months. So the threat there is sea level rise, because when the ice in the Arctic and places like that on the sea ice melts, it doesn't create a rise in the sea level because it's already kind of seawater. It's just frozen, right? It's like when the ice in your glass melts, it doesn't overflow the glass. But when all the ice is on land and it melts, that's coming from somewhere else and going into the ocean, and that's what is going to potentially cause the sea levels to rise. I mean, it's happening, but...
This is Time and Other Thieves, Reflections and Conversations on the Nature of Existence. My name's Sarah B., and the focus of today's episode is climate change. I'm sharing a conversation I recently had with my husband Whitman, who is far more knowledgeable than I am on the science-y aspects of the topic. Later in the program, I'll talk on my own about the spiritual implications of our predicament. And I use the word predicament instead of problem because the latter implies a solution.
So one thing to reiterate is that it's the rate of change that's happening right now that is so concerning. It's changing so fast. What we're looking at is an exponential rate of change. We think we're still living in a linear world where the line is just going up in a predictable way, and we can see where we are today, and we can measure against where we were, last year or last century, and then we can predict how it's going to be in the future. But that's not the world we're living in anymore. And all of these climate patterns that we've relied on since the end of the last ice age, so for 10 or 12,000 years, simply don't exist in the same way now already. They just don't. The monsoons in India, the snowpack in the Sierra Nevada, it's not happening in the same way, and it's not going to. Even the world that existed when I was born in 1969, it doesn't exist anymore. They're estimating now that we're losing 150 to 200 plant and animal species to extinction, like permanently losing them per day. That's an estimate, and it includes species that we haven't even discovered. So I don't know how they arrive at that, but that's what they're saying. But as the human population has doubled in the last 50 years, the animal population has dropped by over half, just in terms of sheer mass. There are studies about insect loss. It goes on and on and on. And this is the kind of stuff that doesn't make the news. Scientists have actually been threatened and had their funding cut and so forth. There's a lot of, once politics gets into it, it's a mess. But the EPA under Trump, they couldn't even use the phrase climate change in their official website, in their documents. It was banned. So obviously there's a concerted effort to keep people in the dark and just keep business as usual until we use up everything and the swine can make all the money they can, I guess.
How do you as a person handle it?
At some point you have to get philosophical. So it becomes a question of adapting. And there's a lot of positive energy that can be put into that. How do we adapt? In fact, there's a good article recently about that, Deep Adaptation. But it starts with the acceptance that we're not living in the same world. It's not going to go back to how it was. And we might not be able to even survive. We should definitely be grieving collectively. The Earth is in a hospice situation. I'm borrowing from another scientist who has used that analogy. What do you do with someone who's in hospice? You don't go to their bedside and, say, "Come on, let's go. Let's do more." You sit with them in the moment and you make the best of it in the time that you've got, and try and reconnect on an emotional level, on a spiritual plane. So, I don't think we should just wallow in grief and give up in despair and all go kill ourselves, but grief allows for compassion to come back. And if we don't have compassion for ourselves in this impending crisis, because it's not going to be pretty. We might make it through, but it's going to get worse before it gets better, and that is going to make everything that's happened look like...
What do you imagine?
Well, mass population loss in various forms. It's already happening.
Yeah, floods, fires, disease.
Nuclear catastrophe, wars, population displacements. If you can't grow crops because wet bulb temperatures in this huge agricultural area, population center, where are the people going to go? They're going to have to go somewhere. The people who are already there are going to be bent out of shape, and there's going to be a war, and, et cetera, et cetera. So if you want, you can stay up late worrying about that. I've decided not to.
Yay.
Right? Because all of this is pretty much out of our hands at this point. You can buy good light bulbs. You can not do Amazon. But how do you take heat out of an ocean? It really does seem to me that we're freaking out, arguing about whether the Titanic is going down and how to rearrange the furniture. But meanwhile, it's going down. So find your peace. what you do today, that's the only thing that matters. And that's probably our ultimate lesson, even if this wasn't happening. But maybe it's taking this for us to learn that.
Do you ever get scared?
Well, of course. I've got kids, and even in my lifetime, we're likely to see some really awful things at massive scale, even for us, right? We're used to it happening when it's those guys on the other side of the world, those poor bastards,
Mm-hmm.
But we're not immune, we're not exempt, and it's already starting here. Yeah, you just got to live your life as if it's going to continue like this for a while, and do whatever you need to do to make yourself feel better, like you're doing something to help, whether that is actually helping people or buying the right light bulbs. That's up to you. Marching in the street, but as long as people keep buying gasoline and burning it in their cars, as long as we keep buying electricity from the power plants that burn coal and natural gas, this isn't going to change.
And even if it did change, even if we did reduce or eliminate our carbon emissions?
There's another paradox. In fact, some are calling it McPherson's paradox, after Guy McPherson, who's a scientist who's outspoken about this stuff. And I think he's a very knowledgeable guy who's done his homework, but he rubs a lot of people wrong. He comes on pretty strong. So, you can take it with a grain of salt, but he has definitely done his homework. His climate summary on his website, Nature Bats Last, there's more information there than you ever wanted to know. And if you want to dispute any of it, all the links are there to go to the original research. It's pretty mind-boggling. He was the first, or one of the first, to identify, it's called global dimming or the aerosol masking effect. Actually, NASA knew about it, and James Hansen did a paper about it in 2010 or something like that. It's the idea that as we're burning the fossil fuels, the greenhouse gases are a result, that CO2, methane, whatever, all that stuff goes up there and it warms the atmosphere, traps the heat, warms the planet. But also all this particulate matter is going up there. Basically soot, particulates. All that stuff goes way high up into the higher parts of the atmosphere, and it hangs out for a while and then eventually settles back down. But we're constantly putting more up there. So there's pretty much a permanent umbrella of this particulate matter, which has the effect of blocking solar radiation. So it's actually mitigating the warming that the gases are causing. It has a cooling effect. It's helping us in that regard. So when we stop putting up so much particulate matter, when we stop or slow down burning fossil fuels, one of the effects, paradoxically, is that we heat up the atmosphere even more. For example, after 9/11, when they stopped the airplanes just over the United States for 3 or 4 days, I think it was, global temperatures spiked. Same thing in 2008 after the recession. One of the main things that happened was the huge cargo ships all but stopped. They pretty much stopped. And they're one of the biggest, if not the biggest, producer of carbon emissions on the planet. I didn't know that. So those things pretty much stopped, and again, global temperatures spiked. So there are reputable studies now suggesting that if we did stop carbon emissions all of a sudden, we would actually cook ourselves even faster, like within 6 to 10 years. So we're very likely in a damned if you do, damned if you don't kind of a place. It's paradoxical. What everyone is saying is going to save the world might actually have the opposite effects.
You're listening to Time and Other Thieves, reflections and conversations on the nature of existence. My name is Sarah B., and today on the show I am focusing on climate change via a recent conversation I had with my husband, Whitman, who happens to know a lot on the subject. Hope you're hanging in there. I know it can be a bit overwhelming and scary to take all of this stuff in. I'm going to get into ways of coping psychologically, emotionally, spiritually with all of this in a few minutes. Whitman has a few more things to say, and then I will dive in to some ideas that Joanna, Macy, and Jem Bendell are sharing in the world and have been sharing for a while now. Many thanks to Whitman for sharing his knowledge and articulating it far better than I could. Here's what he has to say about toxic problem solving.
We're hopefully coming out of a couple of millennia of left brain masculine energy where it's all about thinking.
Problem solving.
Problem solving. Every story that you see about this is, how are we going to fix it? They're talking about putting a huge umbrella in the troposphere to block solar radiation. They're talking about carbon sequestration, pumping all of the carbon out of the atmosphere and putting it into the rocks way down deep, which sounds good, but we don't have the science for that. We can maybe do it in the lab one time, but to do it on a planetary scale indefinitely is just fantasy.
And it's the same kind of thinking that got us into this mess.
Exactly. So I personally don't think we're going to think our way out of it. If we have a chance, we're going to have to feel our way into it and hopefully through it. But we need some models for that. And there are in human culture, but we have to go back a ways, back to the pagan societies that worship the goddess, for example. I'm no expert on that, but the direction that we're going is not going to save us. I'm convinced of that. There are so many examples of our coming up with just incredibly clever and ingenious ways to deal with the problem.
What we see as a problem.
Yeah, what we see as a problem in the environment. And then we're blind to the unintended consequences. The best example I can think of, in Indonesia in the 60s, I believe, there was a big malaria problem in the port cities. So we went in and sprayed with DDT to kill the mosquitoes, and it fixed the malaria problem for a while. But all that DDT pesticide is in the environment, and what happened? Well, a number of things. The DDT sticks around for a while, so it killed off a bunch of other insects, but the ones that it didn't kill had the ability to biomagnify poison. So cockroaches, for example, could ingest a ton of DDT and sequester it in the fat cells of their tail sections, right? That white stuff that comes out when you step on a roach. So it didn't affect their central nervous system or their organs, and they just went about their business, but they were concentrating DDT in their tails. Well, what eats cockroaches in the port cities of Indonesia? One of the things was geckos, these lizards, that also had the ability to biomagnify poison. They could sequester the DDT in the fat cells of their tails. So it was getting more and more concentrated as they ate the cockroaches, but they lived, didn't bother their central nervous system or their organs. Well, that's all fine and dandy, but what eats the lizards? What eats the geckos? In those port cities in Indonesia, it was cats, stray cats, feral cats would eat the lizards and immediately die because they got this insanely concentrated dose of DDT, and they couldn't sequester it in their tails and be fine. So what happens in a tropical port city when all of the feral cats die? The rat population explodes. Rats have fleas. Fleas are a vector for plague. And the next thing you know, after spraying for mosquitoes to fix the malaria problem, you have a bubonic plague outbreak, which is far worse and not so easy to deal with. That kind of thing has happened, just time and time again throughout human history. I think we just have a blind spot when it comes to a realistic view of the future, an ability to conceive how what we do today is going to affect generations down the road. At least this culture. I know other cultures have been a lot better at it than us. Look at that famous speech by Chief Joseph of the Nez Perce. And, maybe it's been a survival mechanism for us to stay focused on the immediate danger and get really good at fixing the problem at hand. Saber-toothed tiger is attacking you. You have to deal real quickly, right? But we're living in a different world. And the people who think that we're going to evolve our consciousness to the point where we don't even need bodies or an environment, a habitat, and we're all going to live in some sort of...
the singularity?
Yeah, singularity. I think it's another fantasy. Sure, go ahead. Believe that if you want. You can believe whatever the hell. But meanwhile, we don't even have the technology to produce electricity in a sustainable way, really. So if we don't start using less of it and everything else, reduce, reuse, recycle. Nobody talks about reduce.
I know.
We got to reduce everything, including human beings. If we don't do that, then, it's not looking good.
It'll get done for us.
So go enjoy the flowers today, I guess, while we can. Everyone's got to come to terms with it in their own way. And for most folks, it's just sheer denial and pushing forward. But it's pretty clear that we're hitting a wall. If you want to look at the evidence for that, there are plenty of studies. They just keep coming out with more that are mind-boggling and sobering. There's a scientist at Cambridge University named Peter Wadhams who has been researching in the Arctic his whole life. There's a guy in Australia named Andrew Glickson who talks a lot about the southern hemisphere and what's going on there. There's a Canadian scientist named Paul Beckwith who has a website, a YouTube channel, whatever, who is really good at finding these deep scientific papers and kind of summarizing them for people like me so we can understand. There's Guy McPherson, of course. arcticnews.blogspot.com. That's a site that is kind of a consortium of climate scientists where they publish info about the Arctic.
They do it kind of anonymously or with pseudonyms?
Well, there's one guy who supposedly runs the thing named Sam Carana, which apparently is a pseudonym. I don't know if it's a pseudonym for one person or for several, but there were threats and so forth. There's enough danger there in publishing the stuff that they do that they decided to do it that way. A lot of Russian scientists who are doing good work in the Arctic, in the east, like the East Siberian shelf there, having to do with the methane release. And it's hard to find those papers here, but they're out there. Mainly what makes the headlines is the wildfires and the floods, which
and the biblical stuff
we're going to see more of, but that's just kind of symptoms of these deeper systemic problems.
This is Time and Other Thieves. I'm Sarah B., and that was my husband, Whitman Bolles, talking about climate change with far more authority than I ever could, because he's read way more about it than I ever could, because I get too scared and depressed when doing such research in any depth. But preparing for today's episode has required that I face my fears and sit with my sadness, not just in letting Whitman tell me more about the climate crisis than I would normally let him tell me in one sitting, and you guys got the edited, abridged version, but also in doing some of my own reading on the subject, and particularly on how I might better deal on an emotional, spiritual, and psychological level. I started my investigation on Joanna Macy's website. I'd heard of her work in the field of climate grief a while ago when listening to an episode of On Being with Krista Tippett. Macy is a scholar of Buddhism, general systems theory, and deep ecology, as well as a longtime activist in movements for peace, justice, and ecology. She's written more than 12 books addressing such topics as the psychological and spiritual issues of the nuclear age, the cultivation of ecological awareness, and the resonance between Buddhist thought and contemporary science. Their titles include Despair and Personal Power in the Nuclear Age, Thinking Like a Mountain, Mutual Causality in Buddhism and General Systems Theory, In Praise of Mortality, World as Lover, World as Self, Active Hope, How to Face the Mess We're In Without Going Crazy, and Coming Back to Life, the updated guide to the work that reconnects. Macy's work that reconnects begins with practicing gratitude, which calms our anxious minds and supports our powers of empathy. The next step in this work, which Macy envisions as happening on a spiral, is honoring our pain for the world. This requires courage, as it demands that we actually experience our pain and acknowledge the pain of others, thereby cultivating compassion, which literally means to suffer with. The third point on the spiral is to see with new/ancient eyes. In doing so, we can sense how interconnected all life is, including past and future generations. And the fourth aspect of the work that reconnects is called going forth, wherein we follow through with the actions that call to us, quote, according to our situation, gifts, and limitations. Then the spiral begins again, regardless of how successful a given venture was. Macy's work that reconnects is rooted in 6 core assumptions. 1. Our earth is alive. It is our larger body. 2. Our true nature is ancient and encompasses far more than the separate self conceptualized by habit and Western society. 3. Our feelings of pain for the world come from our interconnectedness with all beings and are the source of our power to act in ways that help. 4. Our ability to respond to world problems is strengthened when we experience and express our pain, despair, grief, etc., and when that pain is intellectually validated. 5. Through a willing, conscious contact with our pain, we reconnect with life and our minds become clear. 6. In reconnecting with the earth community, humans, animals, plants, and minerals alike, we arouse a desire to act on its behalf. Quote, the steps we take can be modest ones, but they should involve some risk to our mental and social comfort, lest we remain caught in old, safe limits. You can learn more about Joanna Macy's Work That Reconnects by visiting workthatreconnects.org. There's also a wonderful website called activehope.info, where you can enroll in a free 7-week training that Joanna Macy designed with her Active Hope co-author, Chris Johnston. Johnston leads this online course called the Active Hope Foundations Training, which draws a lot on the work that reconnects, and mostly consists of videos, and it provides opportunities to practice what you're learning as you go. It's an incredibly generous offering for those who want to play a more active, compassionate role in responding to the crises of our time. In researching Joanna Macy, I also came across the important work of Jem Bendell. Jem is spelled Jem, which actually resonates with me even more. Bendell says that Macy's concept of active hope might be more like magical hope, a way to avoid, perhaps, deeper inquiry into the intentions one values or into the possible futility of a given action. Instead, he espouses radical hope, which is consciously chosen after relinquishing our denial. Radical hope is, quote, empowered surrender to a situation. Yes, I love the concept of empowered surrender. I know exactly what it means, how it feels. It is a form of letting go that is deeply rooted in the most divine trust imaginable. Bendell says that it, quote, accepts difficult realities about what is happening, as well as one's capabilities to influence things, but still connects with deeper values and requires action to make it real. In surrendering to probable societal collapse, one such real-making action might be to start a garden. Another might be to start cultivating better relationships with one's neighbors. Bendell is a British professor of sustainability leadership and founder of the Institute for Leadership and Sustainability at the University of Cumbria. When Whitman mentioned deep adaptation earlier, he was referring to the paper by the same name that Bendell self-published in 2018. He defines deep adaptation as the personal and collective changes that might help us prepare for and live with a societal collapse due to climate change. And he predicts this collapse will happen in 8 to 10 years. This perspective does not assume that our current sources of sustenance, shelter, security, pleasure, and even identity and meaning will withstand the many sequelae of climate chaos. Deep adaptation does assume that such chaos is inevitable and that humanity will not be able to respond fast enough to protect our global food supplies. It assumes that many people will die young or much sooner than expected. But it also contends that we should still, quote, try to extend the glide and soften the crash and learn from the whole experience. 4 questions guide the work of deep adaptation, which Bendell sees as comprised of resilience, relinquishment, restoration, and reconciliation. For resilience, the question is, what do we most value that we want to keep and how? For relinquishment, it's what do we need to let go of so as not to make matters worse? For restoration, we ask, what could we bring back to help us with these difficult times? And for reconciliation, with what and whom shall we make peace as we awaken to our mutual mortality? Bendell also invites those wanting to practice deep adaptation to keep in mind the principles of compassion, curiosity, and respect. Where compassion is concerned, we must maintain awareness of when our own anger, fear, panic, or insecurity are affecting how we think and behave. We must remember to take care of ourselves, as burnout is common when dealing with such a profound predicament. In returning to curiosity, we humbly acknowledge that we don't have a lot of answers on technical or policy matters. The primary objective of deep adaptation is to, quote, participate in generative dialogue that is founded in kindness and curiosity. And as for respect, it's imperative that we have it for other people's situations and perspectives, as it's only from a place of respect that we can cultivate the healing spaces required for deep adaptation. At its core, this work requires that we accept impermanence and non-control. We can't take heat out of the ocean, and that is going to have drastic, far-reaching, complex consequences. Deep adaptation asks us how we want to be when faced with those consequences. What kind of attitudes do we want to have toward life, our fellow humans, and ourselves? What activities will bolster our emotional resilience and promote our ability to be mature and loving and to make choices that help to reduce harm? What sort of belief system will best support us in this challenge? Bendell suggests that we espouse the idea of an eternal God that moves through the universe, as the universe, right now and forever. He points to spiritual traditions that see despair as a gateway to growth and transcendence. In a speech he gave at a UK Council for Psychotherapy conference in late 2019, he asked if climate-related depression could be seen as a rite of passage, a, quote, horrible but useful means of the positive disintegration of our old stories of self and the future, a means by which we can discover forms of meaning and well-being which do not depend on stories of fitting in better with this society, one that is committing mass destruction of life on Earth. End quote. This reminds me of that Krishnamurti quote, "It is no measure of health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society." Once we have come to terms with our despair over the climate tragedy and what it means for mankind, some scientists say near-term human extinction, but Bendell hasn't jumped on that bus quite yet. We need to allow time for evolving in how we respond to our deepening awareness. We must put in the work of re-envisioning what makes life meaningful and what makes us good. Bendell says that deep adaptation requires that we set aside time and resources for doing things that inspire wonder at life, as well as things that support sense-making and self-reflection. We can expect our personal relationships to change, as well as our approach to spare time. He also encourages people to envision themselves and others being compassionate, playful, and loving. Remember, he says, the future will still be beautiful in its own way, no matter what life forms are in it. So here's where I'm at with the whole thing. I guess I'm in a few different places with it. The first that comes to mind is anger, and I don't mean anger towards the generations who came before me. People love to blame the baby boomers, but it seems to me they were just going about their lives as we've been doing for the most part, trying to pay the bills and have some fun here and there. If our species had really wanted to reduce the intensity of climate chaos, then we should have stopped driving cars, stopped flying in planes, never invented cruise ships, let alone use the things, cut way back on our meat consumption, and relied far less on everyday electricity. But here we are at what some say is the end, and we're still waiting for corporations and the government to do something to solve a problem that now appears to be unsolvable. Anyway, I'm not mad at past generations because those generations are made of humans, and humanity was nothing but a setup from the get-go. We're way too smart for our own good and yet stupid at the same time, especially in groups. And we're physically weak and emotionally fragile, terribly short-sighted, and blind to the love we're made of. So really, how well could this have gone? The methods that we invented for protecting ourselves from the elements have ultimately made those elements even more threatening. Go figure. The irony is downright tragic, and I feel sad for us poor, cursed human beings. I'm just mad that I have to be here for this. Of all the times I could have been born, really? I just really don't wanna. Then there's fear, of course. What am I going to experience in my lifetime because of climate change? How long will that lifetime even be? So much is just so terrifyingly unknown. But then I get philosophical. I realize that there's never been a guarantee that I will have a long, relatively safe and easy life. Nobody gets that guarantee. It's just more obvious these days, the real precariousness of our situation, not only as individuals, but as a species. So then I have this beautiful thought. Maybe it's actually an enormous gift, being alive in this moment. I recall the parable about the wise man who always responded with a bemused, "Is that so?" to any and everything that happened. And the other parable about the wise man who took it a step further and said, "This is good," to everything that happened. And Marcus Aurelius with his stoic assertion that whatever is good. Knowing what I know about climate change, I can appreciate my still seemingly intact environment with such sharp and tender clarity that everything is brightened and made even more beautiful. Knowing that I might not always live with the ease and abundance that currently characterize my charmed existence, I can be so grateful for it that I sometimes feel like my whole body is ringing with gratitude, and whatever usually annoys me or stresses me out no longer does so. I don't rush as much or worry about small things. Even big things like COVID have lost their anxiety-inducing charge. Maybe COVID is nature's relatively merciful way of killing us, and by resisting it, we are insisting on a far scarier, more painful exit. Maybe it's a gift to be alive right now because if we're aware of what's happening with the climate, we can quite literally feel the imperative, which has heretofore mostly happened on an intellectual level, to make the most of our time and energy, and to give all that we can to our relationships, especially our relationship with ourselves. The better you know yourself, the more you will be able to trust that you have everything you need within to remain clear-sighted and full-hearted in the face of any challenge. No exceptions. This has been Time and Other Thieves, reflections and conversations on the nature of existence. Thanks again to Whitman Bolles for sharing some of what he knows about climate change. My name's Sarah B., and I hope you'll check out next week's episode, which will feature a conversation I had with my dear friend since I was 12, Mike Thor. Mike's co-owner of the Whiskey Kitchen restaurant in downtown Raleigh. He'll be talking about the thief that is quadriplegia, which he's been living with since November 20th, 2015. Thank you again for listening, and take good care.